When you think back, how would you describe the people who were your best coaches and teachers? Not necessarily the ones you liked the most, the ones who taught you the most, or helped you grow the most in your abilities and your character. Now, that isn't to say that whether you like them doesn't matter. But the fact is, you can like someone who isn't the best at their job. The nicest guy I ever had as a baseball coach was also one of the worst at actually coaching a team or helping us become better players. This was the coach the year that the team I was on lost every game in the regular season. Nicest guy, not a great coach. That being said, I would also never call someone a great coach or teacher if they were regularly unkind, inconsiderate, or indifferent towards their players or their students. For me, all of the people I personally count as my best teachers and coaches were those who were both seriously and deeply challenged me, but also clearly cared for me and for others as a human being. Now, this was true of my best elementary and high school teachers, baseball coaches, martial arts instructors, and university professors, right up to seminary, at the time at Knox College. One of the most challenging professors at Knox when I was doing my master's was Dr. Charles Fensham. Now, some of you may have known Charles. He lived here in Hamilton for a long time, actually worshiped here at St. Andrews for a few years. His theology courses, they were difficult. They had the most reading of pretty much any class you'd ever take at Knox College. They also had the most regular assignments, almost always assigned something to write every week, and had the longest papers. And even reading week was not a relief because, well, Charles took that name literally. It was a chance to assign you extra reading. And when you were done with the work, you found that he didn't give the top grades very easily either. But at the same time, he was always profoundly kind. He always had time for students to ask questions, and that was true both of those who were excelling as well as those who were struggling. He was always considerate if you had a valid reason for handing an assignment in late, or had a personal situation affecting your ability to work. Charles had been a pastor before he became a professor, and it was clear to all of us who were at Knox at that time that he continued to be a pastor to all of us who were there. It was profoundly clear that he cared even as he pushed and challenged us. Now, I hope this is something that we can see in our passage here today. That we can see that though Jesus is being very tough and challenging to the disciples after the resurrection, and indeed presenting them with a task of unbelievable difficulty, yet I hope we can also see his deep and continuing compassion and love for his friends. And this is something that I think connects this postscript in Mark with the rest of the gospel. As we discussed last week on Easter, most scholars do not think that what is now verses 9 to 20 were originally part of the Gospel of Mark. But if this is the case, then they were added very early on and then widely accepted by the early Christian community. And though they have their own flavor and style, they do fit with the theme of the disciples' doubt and disbelief and failure that runs through the whole of the gospel, the main part of the Gospel of Mark. Indeed, this common theme is probably why this particular collection of resurrection stories was added after the dangling end of verse 8. In our journey through Mark between Christmas and Easter, we have seen the disciples stumble, doubt, and fail again and again. And Jesus does call them on this at regular intervals through the narrative. Yet he never gives up on them either. This is the other theme that goes along with it. Jesus never gives up on his friends. After each failure, stumble, struggle, or disappointment, he continues to call them his friends and keeps them on as his apprentices. And the writer of Mark regularly drops hints that they will eventually succeed. All of which means that the end of the gospel story cannot be, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, the other more obvious reason this can't be the end is because the Gospel of Mark would not have been written if it were. If the women at the tomb had not overcome their fear, or the other disciples had not come to believe that Jesus was truly risen from the dead and continued to be God's Messiah, living King and Lord of all. So the question posed by the verse where our Greek copies of Mark end is how the women at the tomb went from being silent and afraid to courageously announcing the message given to them by the angels that we also heard last week. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. What we now call verses 9 to 20 of Mark 16 were, I think, added to provide an answer to that question if people didn't have one of the other Gospels to look at. And let me say that while the stories told here are, in many ways, just brief sketches, they correspond quite closely with the resurrection stories told in Matthew, in Luke, and in John, even as they have their own distinct perspective and purpose here. So how did the women find the courage to share what they had seen and heard at the tomb and find the faith to believe that it was true? It's simple. The risen Jesus revealed himself to Mary Magdalene to give her that faith and that courage for what she needed to do. When Jesus arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. She then went and told those who had been with him, who were mourning and weeping. They heard that Jesus was alive, that she had seen him. They did not believe it. God had given the women a job to do. He had sent the angels to deliver the message. And seeing angels is something that is actually a privilege in the stories told in the Bible. It doesn't happen all the time. The angels even repeated Jesus' promise that he would not only be raised from the dead, but would meet them in Galilee. That they would not only hear about the resurrection, they would see it and experience it. All they needed to do was to go there and wait for him. And Jesus could have done just that. Leave Mary and the other women at the tomb to do their job, to get over their fear on their own. He and God the Father had given them everything they needed to work it out. And sometimes we do see Jesus do this, encourage people of faith to get on with it, to work it out on their own with the resources that God has given them and given us. But that is not what Jesus does here. He has compassion on Mary, and by extension the other women too. He knows that Mary and the other women have been traumatized by what they have seen and been through on Good Friday. They were the most faithful of his followers. They stayed with Jesus during the crucifixion, and they were the only ones there with him when he died. They were there when his body was taken down from the cross. And they were there when he was buried. And so Jesus comes to Mary. And he does not make her wait. He comes to her right away, before the day is over. Indeed, if we look to the beautiful story told in the Gospel of John, he appears to Mary that very morning. He could have waited. He could have demanded that she came to him up in Galilee, but instead Jesus comes to her where she is. and gives Mary and the other women the strength, courage, and faith to carry out their task. And again, we should not miss that this is a challenging one, a challenging task. In most societies at that time, women's testimony was either inadmissible in court, or if it was considered to be of legal value, was almost always considered to be less reliable than that of a man. And this was, let's face it, this was true up until fairly recently in our society. And even today, women still have to regularly work to be believed. Indeed, one of the reasons why I find the resurrection stories in the Gospels compelling is that it is extremely unlikely that an ancient male writer would make up a story with women as the key witnesses. They'd only do this if it was true. They'd only tell it this way if it was true. Mary and the other women had an uphill battle. And both here and in the stories told in the Gospel of Luke, we hear they were not believed. And that gives Jesus the opportunity to show his compassion again. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to two of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. First of all, I think it's significant that Jesus doesn't just appear to those who were closest to him, to his best students, top players, or most faithful friends. He appears to disciples who don't even get a name in this short statement. Even in the beautiful and fully detailed version of this story told in the Gospel of Luke, we only get one of their names. That's Cleopas. And who was Cleopas? Well, we really don't know. He only appears by name in that one story in Luke, Luke 24. The Gospel of John adds a detail that one of the Marys at the crucifixion was the wife of Clopas, which may or may not be the same person. And that's it. We never hear about what Cleopas did during Jesus' normal human ministry, and we never hear about him or this other disciple again, whether it was his wife Mary or someone else. This means that Jesus wasn't just concerned with the disciples who would have seemed the most important. He appeared to the most ordinary and unremarkable in the group, which means he cared for all of them. He cared for each and every single one of them. And they too could have a critical role in this mission of resurrection. These two run back, share the good news with the others. Now, unlike Mary, they are also not believed. And here we do see things getting a little bit more serious. We're now up to the point where there are at least 3 witnesses who have seen 2 different appearances of Jesus in 2 different places at 2 different times, repeating the same promise that Jesus had given to the whole group. Plus, the testimony of the angels at the tomb. At this point, we might understand if Jesus just headed up to Galilee and saved his final appearance and best jobs for whoever had the faith to make the journey. But he doesn't. He comes to the core group of disciples still hiding out in a house somewhere in Jerusalem. He appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And then he said to them, "Go into the world and preach the gospel to all creation." Again, it's worth noting that Jesus doesn't go easy on them. But we should not miss the fact that him being there at all is an act of compassion in itself. And this is where the appendix to Mark fits perfectly with the main part of the gospel. Jesus challenges those who follow him. He calls them, yes, on their mistakes, but he never gives up on them, even when they might want him to. Because this little scene in Mark 16 presents the Christian mission in what I think is perhaps the most grandiose terms of any of the Gospels. Let's hear that final sentence again. Go and preach, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. It's worth mentioning that the Greek word translated as world is actually cosmos. The mission of the church is of cosmic significance, even as it is given to people of no apparent importance or special ability. So what can we take from all this today? Well, what I take from these stories is the fact that if God and Jesus have given us a difficult task or send us on a challenging journey, they do not send us out alone. We are not on our own. Jesus is not just ahead of us, waiting for us to catch up to him. He is with us, even before we take the first step. And I believe that this is true both as it applies to our mission as Christian communities, as churches, as well as in our personal journeys as individuals and families. God never sends us on a journey without going with us. And this is true whether we are filled with profound faith or are struggling with doubt. Even when that doubt turns into stubborn disbelief, to faithlessness. Indeed, I like to remind people that there are separate words for doubt and unbelief or disbelief in the New Testament. What was used here in this story from Mark 16 is flat out disbelief, unbelief. Doubt, you can have faith and still doubt, but even if you get even further than that, into a place of being unable to believe, Jesus will still come to us. And indeed, Jesus can come to us in many ways. I know there are people who have had profound experiences of Jesus' risen presence in their life. I've been privileged to have a couple of them. I know other people experience him in different ways. One of the most unassuming is the fact that Jesus can come to us and other Christians, surprise us through people who show us an act of resurrection life in their kindness. And that is one of the things that these resurrection stories highlight, is we're not just given words to hold on to, but Jesus doesn't live just in words, but he lives embodied. And in case we ever forget that, he gave us this. That's why I always believe it's so important for us to regularly celebrate the Lord's Supper. To remember that the resurrection is as real as a piece of bread that we can take in our hands. That Jesus enters and lives in us just as we can take wine, juice, and have that reside in us. Jesus is with us. His resurrection is a physical reality. He is going with us in our personal journeys, and he is with us as we set out on this next stage of our journey as a congregation. And thanks be to God for that. Amen.